Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Speaker, I want to pick up where my colleague Leanne Dalzell left off, saying that of course we will support this bill. We agree with its objectives. Who would not? However, it doesn't abrogate a government's responsibility to be an active player in supporting and maintaining and enhancing consumer rights. And my colleague talked about the earthquake, and I see there was one member over there who was sort of spitting bile over at this side as she was speaking about the difficult situation that many of our consumers are dealing with in Canterbury, in my area and others, and the situation that they find themselves where they're dealing with the monster insurance company, legaled up, all the experts, and their granny or granddad at 83 with a munted house on their own, not knowing what to do, and receiving very, very little support, if any, from the Crown, apart from the good offices of, say, the Community Law Service, the Citizens Advice Bureau and their legal expertise, and others. And the odds of them getting a good deal are stacked against them. And most of us in this House are not lawyers, so we don't have that precision of legal expertise to interpret contracts and documents that are put in front of us. But I suspect most of us in this House have the wherewithal to go and hire the experts we need to assure ourselves of the fact that the deal that might be put in front of us by an insurance company in that situation in Canterbury or others is either a good deal or is not a good deal. And I know from dealing with local folks in Canterbury that, for instance, a very straight example, even when it comes to pathways and driveways, where individual folks have been asked by project managers to sign a contract, in one case I think it was 14 pages, before the job was done, which had blank dollar figures in it. Blank dollar figures. Now, that's not on, and the point my colleague was making is there is a role, even despite this law, for a government that felt that it was appropriate to surgically intervene on these matters in respect of, say, insurance companies and some of the examples I've cited. There is a role for government to surgically intervene despite the passage of this legislation and its overarching objectives and remedies in respect of consumer rights. In respect of consumer rights. And we know, of course, that this, what's the term, the behaviour term? Unconscionable behaviour is catered for to be dealt with in this legislation. And you'd have to argue, oh, we'll get to you in a minute. 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 We'll get to you. Oh, well, I wasn't the one that interjected on the colleague, because the old acid drop on the corner there has a crack. But unconscionable behaviour is dealt with in this bill. And when we talk about, if we're going to talk about individuals, when we talk about unconscionable behaviour, I'm mindful of some examples, sir, a bit close to home. One could look at, and one would hope that this legislation, sir, would deal with what I call the brown bag factor. The brown bag factor, where brown bag banks, of course, got himself into some difficulty.
Order. Look, the member can use the illustration, but we're not going to put tags around people's names.
Be it for me, sir, to refer to the Honourable John Archibald Banks in that way. But we could look at Mr Banks' situation and ask whether his situation would be dealt with in some way, shape or form under this legislation. I'm mindful of the fact that it deals with false and misleading representations. I would have thought that would have been very germane to the Honourable John Archibald Banks and his situation in respect of Mr .com. I'm mindful here of a passage which is very interesting, which talks about unsolicited goods and services. And we know that the Honourable John Archibald Banks alleges that he received some unsolicited, or were they solicited? We're not quite sure what the nature of the bodyguard or what was in the brown bag, not referring to the Honourable John Archibald Banks, sir, whether those services or goods or dollars or rocks and stones or gold bars or whatever they could have been were unsolicited or not. Mr Banks maintains they weren't solicited. Mr Banks maintained when he received the bag, the sack, the envelope, the whatever, that he didn't know what was in it. And I'm mindful of the passage in the legislation on page 3, under that heading that says unsolicited goods and services to ensure that museums, and I don't know whether they're referring to that old political relic, John Archibald Banks, still treat anonymous goods and services left with them as gifts rather than as goods under their care which they are obliged to try to return. Now, I don't know whether that old political relic, Mr Banks, is sort of, when the officials drafted this, they were mindful of Mr Banks' situation. I don't know. I do note that with interest, and I would ask whether this was an unsolicited good or service. I do note in the media, sir, that Mr Banks has purchased an elephant, and I don't know whether that was an unsolicited purchase or the elephant in the room. I don't know whether the name of that elephant, whether it's been given a name, maybe brain fade or something like that. But I do note from fifth form science that I am told that elephants have a damn good memory. And I'm wondering if Mr Banks has looked at this legislation, sir, and thought maybe a remedy for his lack of memory is to purchase an elephant. And that elephant may be able to provide some instruction. He may remember what his name is. He may remember where he comes from, what he did yesterday, whether he took a helicopter, whether he met Kim.com, what was in the brown bag, what was in the envelope. This could be very, very instructive. It could be a remedy in medical science that we have simply not seen to date, and Mr Banks may have made a breakthrough. This could be, as my colleague says, a high-tech breakthrough, given that elephants never forget. Elephants never forget. So I look forward to the scientific or DNA evidence or research that will be probably published in Harvard medical journals and other learned institutions around the world as they compare the size of Mr Banks's fading memory and cranium with that of his elephant brain fade. And it will be interesting to see where we go with that. And I know that the learned judiciary in coming days next year may call the elephant actually as a witness on medical advice to the only credible witness on medical advice to provide some sort of benchmark for amnesia or other medical conditions. Sir, on a more serious note, this is important legislation, and none of us in this House would disagree with protecting and enhancing consumer rights. And we've seen cases over recent years where consumers have been led down the garden path, have not had their rights preserved and have been abused commercially and otherwise. I suppose I come back to my original point, which was that there is still a role for government, because even this legislation once put through, and I don't mean any disrespect to our communities, but it is reliant on those in the communities who have the experience or the skill or in many cases the financial resources to act in a way which, despite the legislation, can protect their own interests. What I get concerned about is those vulnerable souls out there who don't have the experience perhaps of us in the House and other places, who don't have perhaps I wouldn't say guts, that would be inappropriate, but wouldn't have the be brave enough, if you like, in the face of, say, insurance companies to say no or to resist, or confidence, yeah, that's the word I was looking for, confidence, to resist some of the pressure which is put on consumers. And they are out there on their own. They don't have the facility to seek advice, they don't have the resources to seek advice, and all they're seeking actually, they're very smart. They want to know whether this is a good deal or not, but they don't have the resources that we do in our areas of interest to gain that backup, to have that confidence, to gain that support. And despite this legislation, there will always be a role to protect those people, and in some cases, not to be unfair, often from themselves, from a position of a lack of knowledge where they get themselves into difficulty, where they put themselves under pressure or they're subject to pressure of commercial interests, acting in good faith, those individuals are, but they get themselves, and we've all dealt with them in our various communities, tied up in legal and consumer knots. So there is a place here, I think, for consumer education to be enhanced, and there is always a place, despite any legislation put through, where governments must be prepared, as I said at the start of my speech, to surgically intervene where there are gaps and where commercial entities try and pull the wool.
I call Mojo Mathers.